At its zenith, Carthage commanded the western Mediterranean the way a heart commands a body, through pressure, rhythm, and reach. Its harbor, a double basin carved into the Tunisian coastline near modern-day Tunis, could hold more than 200 warships at once, each slotted into a covered dock cut from stone and concealed from the eyes of foreign sailors. The commercial port adjacent handled the flow of goods from every shore the Phoenician world had ever touched. Tin from the Atlantic coast of Iberia, silver from the mines near Cádiz, grain from the fertile hinterlands of North Africa, purple dye from the murex shells that gave the Phoenicians their Greek name. By the 4th century BCE, the city held perhaps 400,000 people, making it one of the largest urban centers on Earth, rivaling Athens, dwarfing Rome. Byrsa Hill rose at the city's center, crowned by temples and administrative buildings and the homes of Carthage's ruling elite. Below it, streets fanned outward in a pattern that Roman writers would later describe with grudging admiration. Apartment blocks rose to 6 stories. Plumbing systems channeled water through the districts. The Tophet, the sacred precinct where votive offerings were burned and interred, occupied its own enclosure near the southern harbor, accumulating thousands of urns over centuries. The city's influence extended far beyond its walls. Carthaginian colonies and trading posts dotted Sardinia, western Sicily, the Balearic Islands, Ibiza, and the southern Iberian coast. The language was Punic, a western dialect of Phoenician, itself a Canaanite tongue from the Levant. The religion carried the gods of Tyre and Sidon westward, Baal Hammon, Tanit, Melkart. The alphabet, that extraordinary Phoenician invention from which Greek, Latin, Arabic, and eventually English lettering would descend, circulated through every port the Carthaginians controlled. And then it was gone. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE, at the close of the Third Punic War, was not merely a military defeat. It was an erasure. Roman forces under Scipio Aemilianus breached the walls after a 3-year siege that had starved the defenders to the point of cannibalism, according to the ancient sources. Street by street, house by house, the Romans fought their way to Byrsa Hill. The final stand lasted 6 days. When it ended, 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The city was set alight. Ancient accounts say the fires burned for 17 days. The ruins were systematically demolished. And then, in an act that has echoed through historical memory ever since, Roman authorities ordered the ground sown with salt, cursing the earth so that nothing would grow there again. Whether the salting literally occurred remains debated among historians. What is not debated is the intent. Carthage was to be obliterated, not just defeated, but unmade, its very name synonymous with annihilation. The Punic language faded over the following centuries, though Augustine of Hippo noted its continued use in North Africa as late as the 5th century CE. The temples were dismantled or repurposed. The libraries and the Carthaginians were, by all accounts, a literate civilization were destroyed or dispersed. Nearly everything we know about the Carthaginians was written by their enemies. The Greeks called them treacherous. The Romans called them cruel. Neither called them human in the way they called themselves human. So what happened to the people? Not the city, the people. The genetic lineages, the bloodlines, the biological reality of a civilization that had stretched from Lebanon to the Strait of Gibraltar for nearly 1,000 years. For generations, the answer seemed straightforward. The Carthaginians were Phoenicians. The Phoenicians came from the Levant, the coastal strip of what is now Lebanon, with extensions into Syria and northern Israel. According to tradition, Carthage itself was founded around 814 BCE by Queen Elissa, Dido, in the Roman telling, who fled the city of Tyre after a dynastic murder. Her followers sailed west, established a settlement on the Tunisian coast, and built the seed of what would become an empire. The DNA of the Carthaginians, therefore, should look Levantine. It should carry the genetic signatures of the Bronze Age, Canaanite populations from which the Phoenicians emerged. If you tested 1,000 Carthaginian skeletons, you should find what you'd find in ancient Sidon or Byblos or Tyre. Western Asian lineages, Mediterranean farmer ancestry with a Levantine inflection, Y-chromosome haplogroups like J1 and J2 that had been tentatively proposed as markers of Phoenician expansion. That was the working assumption. Some scholars proposed that local North African populations, Berbers, Libyans, indigenous groups predating the Phoenician arrival, had been absorbed into Carthaginian society over time, adding a secondary genetic layer. But the core expectation held firm. The Carthaginians were, biologically, Levantine colonists and their mixed descendants. The Phoenician homeland in the east had seeded the Punic world in the west. Culture, language, religion, and blood had traveled together. This assumption was already wobbling by 2016, when the first ancient DNA from a Phoenician individual was published. Lisa Madisou-Smith and colleagues at the University of Otago extracted mitochondrial DNA from a young man buried in a sandstone sarcophagus on Byrsa Hill, the very summit of Carthage. The tomb, discovered by gardeners in 1994, while planting a tree near the entrance to the National Museum of Carthage, contained an undisturbed burial dating to the late 6th century BCE. Funerary goods included Punic amphorae, a lamp, an ivory box of ointments, and several amulets. Osteological analysis placed the young man, known now as Arich, or simply the young man of Byrsa, at 19 to 24 years of age, approximately 1.7 meters tall, with cranial features suggesting Mediterranean or European rather than African affinity. His mitochondrial haplogroup was U5beta-C1. That haplogroup is European, not Levantine, not North African, European, and specifically one of the oldest European lineages in existence, tracing to Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who inhabited the continent before the Neolithic farming revolution. U5 is estimated to have arisen roughly 25,000 to 30,000 years ago. The sublineage U5beta-C1 had been previously identified in remains from La Braña in northwestern Spain, dating to approximately 7,000 years ago. In modern populations, it appears at very low frequencies, predominantly in the Iberian Peninsula and northwestern Europe. It has never been identified in the Levant, either in ancient or modern samples. Madisou-Smith's team sequenced 47 modern Lebanese individuals belonging to haplogroup U. Not one carried U5beta-C or any of its daughter lineages. A Phoenician young man, buried at the pinnacle of Carthage, carrying the mitochondrial signature of a Mesolithic European hunter-gatherer. It was a single data point, a single mitochondrial genome. It proved only that his mother's lineage was European, nothing about the rest of his ancestry. But it was a crack in the wall, and 9 years later the wall came down entirely. In April 2025, Harold Ringbauer and David Reich, leading a massive international collaboration between the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and Harvard University, published a study in Nature that redrew the genetic map of the Phoenician Punic world. The scale was unprecedented. Genome-wide data, not just mitochondrial, but autosomal, Y-chromosomal, the full nuclear picture, from 210 ancient individuals, including 196 from 14 sites traditionally identified as Phoenician or Punic. The sites span the Levant, North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, Ibiza, and the Iberian coast. Among them were the great urban centers of the Punic world, Carthage, Motya, Cádiz. Standing in front of this data, even the researchers paused. The Levantine site of Akhziv, a Phoenician settlement in what is now northern Israel, behaved exactly as expected. Individuals buried there derived more than 80% of their ancestry from Bronze Age Levantine populations. They looked genetically like Canaanites, like the people of ancient Sidon, whose DNA had been published in earlier studies. This was the Phoenician homeland, and the genetics confirmed it. But when the team turned to the Punic sites, to Carthage, to Motya in Sicily, to Tyre in Sardinia, to Valericos and Cádiz and Malaga in Iberia, the Levantine signal all but disappeared. Only 3 individuals from Punic contexts across the entire dataset carried substantial Levantine ancestry, and 2 of those came from Sicily during a period overlapping with Roman control. In every region, in every century sampled, the dominant ancestral component in Punic individuals was not Levantine. It was Sicilian-Aegean, the primary genetic source for the people of Carthage, the people who spoke Punic, who worshipped Tanit and Baal Hammon, who fought the Punic Wars, who sent Hannibal across the Alps, resembled Bronze Age populations from Sicily and the Aegean. The QP atom modeling, using 8 genetically homogeneous reference groups, consistently assigned the largest ancestry fraction to a profile matching Bronze Age Sicilians and Mycenaean-era Greeks. 84% of sampled individuals from Kerkuane and Carthage carried more than 50% Sicilian-Aegean ancestry. Even in North Africa, this was the dominant component. Even in the beating heart of Punic civilization, the Levantine founders had left almost no detectable genetic trace. A second ancestry source, indigenous North African, modeled using an early Iron Age individual from inland Algeria, appeared in varying proportions, growing after approximately 400 BCE as Carthaginian power expanded into the African interior. But it remained a minority component everywhere, below 50% in all individuals except a handful from Kerkuane, Valericos, and Tharos. The Y-chromosome data were equally striking. No single paternal lineage dominated the Punic sample. The most common haplogroup was E1b, found in 14 of 58 males, a lineage with deep roots in both Africa and the Mediterranean. R1b appeared in 10 individuals. Gateway, the haplogroup long proposed as a marker of Phoenician expansion, was present in only 8, and at frequencies no higher than those observed in Bronze Age Aegean and Minoan populations. The hypothesis that J2 could serve as a diagnostic fingerprint for Phoenician colonization from the Levant was, in the team's own words, challenged. The diversity itself was the signal. Each Punic site contained males with different Y haplogroups, a level of paternal heterogeneity exceeding anything observed in Mediterranean populations since the 5th millennium BCE. These were not closed communities reproducing in isolation. These were open, cosmopolitan populations drawing from a vast genetic pool, and then there were the relatives. Using identical by descent segment analysis, the team identified 31 pairs of individuals sharing long genomic segments indicative of a common ancestor within the preceding 20 generations. Most pairs were from the same site or neighboring sites, but 6 pairs connected individuals across the Mediterranean Sea, a person buried in Byrsa, Sicily, and a person buried in Kerkuane, Tunisia, a person in Motya, Sicily, and a person in Carthage. One pair from Byrsa and Kerkuane shared 3 long IBD segments, placing them as 5th to 7th degree relatives, roughly 2nd to 3rd cousins. These 2 people, or their immediate ancestors, had physically crossed the sea. The genetic barrier that the Mediterranean had maintained between Sicilian and North African populations for millennia was being crossed routinely by people within the Punic network. If you're following this story and wondering what it means for our understanding of ancient civilizations, of how culture moves through the world, this is the moment to consider how profoundly these findings reshape things. They never vanished. The Carthaginians, the Punic peoples of the Western Mediterranean, they were never primarily Levantine to begin with. The culture was Phoenician. The language was Phoenician. The gods, the alphabet, the funeral rites, the trade practices, all traceable to the coastal cities of Bronze Age Lebanon. But the people who carried that culture westward, who maintained it across centuries and thousands of kilometers of coastline, were overwhelmingly drawn from the populations already living in the central Mediterranean. Sicilians, Aegean islanders, North Africans. The Phoenician expansion was not a mass migration of Levantine colonists who replaced local populations. It was a cultural transmission, a franchise model, if you will, in which a small founding elite from Tyre or Sidon established trading posts and colonies that rapidly assimilated the surrounding populations. Within a few generations, the genetic contribution of the original Levantine founders had been diluted to the point of invisibility. What remained was the culture, the language, the religion carried forward by people whose ancestors had lived in Sicily and the Aegean and North Africa long before the first Phoenician ship appeared on the western horizon. This is not without precedent. The same pattern, cultural transmission outpacing genetic replacement, has been documented in other ancient expansions. But the Carthaginian case is perhaps the most dramatic, because the cultural identity was so strong, so coherent, so politically powerful that it sustained 3 wars against Rome. Hannibal Barca, the greatest military mind of the ancient Western Mediterranean, commanded an army and a civilization whose very name, Punic, from the Latin punicus, derived from the Greek phoenix, meaning Phoenician, announced a Levantine origin that the DNA now reveals to have been, in biological terms, a memory rather than a reality. The salt the Romans poured on Carthaginian soil was meant to kill the city's future. In a sense, it succeeded. The physical city was destroyed. The language eventually fell silent. The libraries were burned. But the people, the actual biological people, continued. Their genomes flowed into the Roman-era populations of Sicily and North Africa, into the Byzantine and medieval communities that followed, into the modern populations of Tunisia and southern Italy and Sardinia, who carry, in percentages they'll likely never calculate, fragments of Sicilian-Aegean ancestry that once circulated through the ports and markets of a Punic world. Byrsa Hill still stands. The National Museum of Carthage occupies its summit, built atop the ruins of the ruins. In 1994, gardeners planting a tree discovered a young man who had been waiting in sandstone for 25 centuries. His mitochondrial DNA told us he was European. His culture told us he was Phoenician. And now, the genomes of 200 of his contemporaries tell us something larger, that civilizations are not bloodlines. That the most powerful empires in human history have been built not by one people, but by many, bound together not by